You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. In the final days of the spring legislative session, lawmakers came to an agreement on carbon capture legislation. The topic has been running rampant through Illinois as companies have tried to take advantage of federal tax incentives and build these carbon capture projects across central Illinois. Joining us now is Representative Ann Williams, who is one of the sponsors of this legislation in the House. Representative, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So for years, this topic was tossed around the Capitol, and there seemed to be a real stalemate between environmentalists, property owners, and farmers, and industry really wanting to take advantage of this, not just for those federal tax incentives, but they often said it was a necessary part of meeting the state's clean energy goals set forth in the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. We really saw this come together it seemed very quickly to the public eye, but can you take us into a little bit of those negotiations and how this final version of this bill came together?
Well, sure. You're right. This has been a topic that we've discussed for some time. You'll probably remember a few years ago, we commissioned a study through the University of Illinois Prairie Research Institute to review the process, the technology, and share with the General Assembly practical issues with regard to it and how we might move forward. The report was issued, I'd want to say 3-4 years ago. And since then, we've had numerous discussions, various iterations of bills introduced. But finally, with the federal tax credit program in place and the fact that projects we're looking to locate in Illinois, we thought we better move forward and get some regulations in place and make sure Illinois was ready if this technology was going to come to our state.
So when this all came together, I talked to several people about how it was really the governor's office kind of stepped in here and kind of tried to bring everybody to the table and get everybody in agreement on this. Is that how this kind of went down? And where were the real compromises we saw from both sides on getting this done?
Well, the governor's office did pull together all the stakeholders, which I think was a critical part of moving us forward. We had industry players. Of course, the environmental community was very active in the conversations, and organized labor, as well as landowners. And you really needed to hear from all the stakeholders to make sure we could move forward with a technology that was going to help decarbonize a very difficult to decarbonize sector, the industrial sector, while doing so in a way that kept communities safe. And we felt at the end of the day, we had the strongest product possible. It was a difficult negotiation, but one in which we were all incentivized to complete. Without this bill in place, Illinois' regulations were simply not tight enough for many of us to feel comfortable moving forward.
There's a couple important distinctions that need to be made when talking about this, because this bill focuses on all of them, but really there's the carbon capture, which is when the carbon emissions are captured before they head into the atmosphere. Then there's the sequestration, which we already have some projects across Illinois that have these businesses that have these projects already. ADM in Decatur is often used as an example of this, where they take their captured carbon and store them underground on, at their facilities. Then you also have these carbon dioxide pipelines, and those are really sectioned out in this law. That's been the huge conversation over the past 2 years, is these companies trying to make these massive pipelines that stretch not only across Illinois, but into other states as well. A lot of safety concerns were brought up as a result of this. A lot of the lack of regulation was brought up in part about this. You guys really decided in this bill to say until new federal safety regulations come down, there's going to be a 2-year ban, or unless those safety regulations come down sooner, that would be lifted on these particular projects. Why was that a important caveat here?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that there were a lot of concerns from communities as to the safeguards that attach to these pipeline projects. As you mentioned, there's the capturing of the carbon, there's the transportation piece before you get to the sequestration. But that transportation piece is governed in large part by the federal government. Illinois has a limited role that we can play in terms of safety regulations. So what we did here was, unless federal regulations are in place, or I should say until federal regulations are in place from the regulatory agency that governs pipelines, we would have a moratorium on new pipeline projects. But we also added additional safeguards above and beyond what's required federally, really at all stages of the process, including the pipelines where we regulated where we could, the federal government, where they had not stepped in.
There was a lot of concerns brought up on the House floor. This had bipartisan support, but there was some concerns brought up specifically around the Muhammad Aquifer. I'm wondering why that didn't have an exemption or an exclusion in this particular language. And I know you mentioned the Prairie Research Institute report. Why did there not need to be this kind of exemption for obviously major sources of drinking water for parts of the state?
We really looked carefully at the science behind carbon sequestration. In addition to the Prairie Institute report, we really took a look at what other states were doing and what we knew about how these projects works and the mechanics and the physics of how carbon acts. And what we learned was that the carbon is stored deep underground, behind or under many, many layers of shale. And there are protections in place that we required above and beyond what the federal government required to make sure that any pipelines and any wells that went through any protected water were compliant with the very rigorous Class 6 well requirements on the federal level and went a step further, requiring additional regulations on the state level. Things like making sure that the materials were appropriate, the process were appropriate, tests were implemented to make sure there was no room for error. And in the worst case scenario, if there was some sort of issue, consistent monitoring throughout the process so that we would be aware of any potential problem. I will point out that California did lead the way in terms of carbon sequestration project regulation, and they too regulated it similar to what we did. We did not find anywhere that you would ban utilizing a well through any drinking water source beyond the aquifer. There are numerous other places where Illinoisans get their drinking water, and those are all very carefully and very methodically protected under the Class 6 well requirements. So these are much higher than your regular wells, and we felt very comfortable moving forward as is. It would have been easier to message and say we're not going into the aquifer, but we really based it on science and what was practical there.
This whole conversation posed quite an interesting little dilemma for environmentalists in this matter, because there were a lot of environmental concerns without regulation around these projects. Obviously, carbon dioxide leaking, these emissions leaking could cause a numerous bunch of problems, but we heard pretty frequently from industry, I already mentioned the one, that without this kind of technology, it was going to be very difficult for companies to meet the emission standards that the state has in place. But there was also, we heard from the Corn Growers Association, that carbon capture was a vital part of getting the biofuel industry in Illinois up and running. And when that really added into this whole equation, I just thought it was very interesting, because there's the environmental benefits of it, but then there's also, you have to balance those with the risks. And on the other end of this is all just to reach these big goals that are major parts and could be even greater environmental achievements down the road. From your perspective, as somebody who's obviously been instrumental in a lot of clean energy policy, a lot of environmental policy in the Capitol, was that a balancing act you were accustomed to at this point, or was this kind of a new approach?
Well, I think you're right. The only reason I'm even talking about this sort of technology is because we need to look at ways to decarbonize everywhere we can. The climate crisis is escalating exponentially. We're feeling it literally right now across the country in terms of our record temperatures. We need to take steps to decarbonize everywhere we can. As you know, the industrial applications like ethanol plants, for example, are very difficult to decarbonize. The reality is right now we do still rely on fossil fuels for some things. And until we get to the point that we no longer rely on fossil fuels, we have to look at ways to decarbonize the sectors that are very hard to otherwise address. For example, you can't decarbonize a cement plant or an ethanol plant through using clean energy power sources like we did in CEJA, the windmills and the solar farms, et cetera. So carbon sequestration, I think, provides a good tool for now until we get to the point that we don't need to rely on fossil fuels at all. And I am hoping that day is coming.
I know you had said that all the stakeholders were at the table, but there are a lot of people who have gotten very involved in the pushback to these kinds of projects locally. And they see the news about this agreement coming through, these regulations coming through, especially when we're talking about landowners and environmentalists. And I wonder, what message would you have for them to assure that their concerns were heard in this process and it wasn't just another very quick Springfield deal getting pushed through?
Well, I certainly understand the concerns and have spoken to many landowners about their concerns. And I'd like to start by saying this is a tool to make sure that if a project moves forward, it is done so in the safest manner possible. Without this law, there are no regulations in place sufficient to, I think, protect communities. So whether a project moves forward or not is less of a concern, I think, than if it does move forward, do we have the proper safeguards in place for communities? We have many places within this law and our regulatory structure that puts the power on the local communities to make the decision as to whether a project is appropriate for their area. There are robust public hearings we required, and that's something that the environmental community really fought for. The locals really have a lot to say and a lot of role to play in the decision about whether to locate the projects in those areas. But if in fact they decide to move forward on the state level, we wanted to make sure the protections were in place. And we feel that we have nation leading protections here. They're the strongest in the nation. And if a project is to locate here in Illinois, we feel that we've taken the steps to make it safe.
All right, well, Representative Ann Williams, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.
Thank you.